Don't be late again tonight, Carson. We have the company party. Heather's voice drifted from the kitchen as the sound of mugs clinking together followed. Carson was standing near the front door, pretending to check something on his phone. He was buying time, trying to control the flood of emotions boiling just beneath the surface. Her voice sounded casual, but to him, it carried a weight, a familiarity that was no longer comforting. It was a warning, a reminder of what the night would bring. Carson glanced toward the kitchen, seeing her back as she reached for the coffee pot. She was the same Heather he'd known for over a decade, physically at least. The way her hair fell, the smooth, practiced movements, the scent of her perfume, it was all familiar. Yet, something had shifted between them in ways neither of them dared to speak aloud. Wouldn't miss it, Carson muttered, trying to keep his tone neutral as he slipped his phone into his pocket. He crossed the room, accepting the cup of coffee she held out to him. Their hands brushed for a brief moment, but there was no warmth. There hadn't been for months. Heather flashed him a quick smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Carson noticed how stiff her shoulders seemed, how she shifted slightly on her feet. Good. Jasper's going to be there, you know. He's the life of the party. Her voice had an edge of excitement, one that Carson had come to recognize all too well. The mention of Jasper's name made his stomach churn. He watched as her fingers twitched slightly against the handle of her coffee cup. She wasn't just talking about her boss. Carson could hear it, the subtle inflection in her voice. She wasn't merely looking forward to seeing Jasper. She was eager. Carson took a sip of his coffee and nodded, forcing himself to keep calm. He couldn't react, couldn't let on that he knew. Jasper's quite the character, he said, keeping his words deliberately vague. The comment was neutral enough, but in his head, he could barely stand to think about Jasper, the smug, arrogant man who had been sleeping with his wife for years. He'd always suspected something was off between Heather and Jasper. At first, it was just little things, late nights at the office, excuses about work emergencies, a growing emotional distance. But when her unexplained absences became more frequent and her enthusiasm for her job grew suspiciously intense, Carson's gut told him there was more to the story. One night, after Heather had once again come home late, Carson found himself staring at her as she slept. He knew. He didn't need proof. He could feel it in the cold way she barely looked at him anymore, the disinterest in her eyes when they spoke. But that night he made a decision. He wasn't going to confront her, not yet. He needed to know the full truth. That's when he hired the private investigator. The results came back quicker than Carson had anticipated. A manila envelope filled with pictures, texts, and emails that painted a clear picture. Jasper and Heather had been seeing each other for years. The affair wasn't a fling. It was something far more calculated, something deeper. Carson remembered the night he sat on the edge of the bed, flipping through the photographs of his wife and Jasper in various intimate moments. Hotel rooms, out-of-town business trips that Heather had claimed were essential for her career. In each image, Heather's face was filled with joy, a joy that had been missing from their marriage for longer than he cared to admit. It wasn't the evidence that devastated him. It was the realization of how long he'd been living a lie. But Carson didn't rage. He didn't smash the pictures or storm into the bedroom to wake her. Instead, he did something different. He waited. He wasn't going to confront her in a fit of anger. That would have been too easy for her. And Jasper. Carson knew he had to play the long game. He needed them to feel the consequences in a way that would tear their lives apart, just as they had torn his. And then there was Adela, Jasper's wife. Carson hadn't expected their paths to cross in the way they had. He remembered the first time they met, almost by accident. He had gone to Jasper's office building to pick Heather up from work one evening when he bumped into Adela in the parking lot. She seemed distracted, disoriented even. Carson could tell right away that something was wrong, but he didn't know just how deeply intertwined their fates would become. After discovering the affair, Carson reached out to Adela. It was a risky move, but one he felt he had to take. They met at a small coffee shop a few miles outside of town, far from prying eyes. Adela's face had been pale when Carson slid the manila envelope across the table to her. She didn't need to open it to know what it contained. She had already suspected the truth. "They've been sleeping together, haven't they?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Carson nodded, not bothering to sugarcoat it. "For years." Adela exhaled sharply, closing her eyes for a moment before opening them again. There was pain, sure, but there was also something else. Determination. I don't want to be a victim in this, Adela said after a long pause, her hands gripping the edge of the table. I want to make them pay. Carson had been surprised at her intensity, but at the same time, he admired it. He felt the same. Together, they devised a plan that would ruin Jasper and Heather in ways they couldn't see coming. Months passed. Carson played his role perfectly, continuing as if nothing had changed. He attended events with Heather, made small talk, pretended to be the doting husband. But all the while, he was gathering evidence, working with Adela to set the stage for their revenge. Heather remained oblivious, caught up in her double life with Jasper. Every time she mentioned his name, Carson's resolve grew stronger. He had to keep reminding himself that this would be worth it, that waiting for the right moment was the key to everything. On the morning of the party, Carson could feel the tension building. Heather seemed more on edge than usual, though she tried to hide it behind her usual calm demeanor. "Everything okay?" Carson asked as she glanced at her reflection in the mirror for what felt like the 100th time. Her hands were slightly shaky, her movements more hurried. "Of course," she said quickly, smoothing down her dress. "Just a little nervous about tonight." Carson nodded. He could tell she was lying, but it didn't matter anymore. "Well, you look great," he said, offering a smile that felt hollow. Heather gave a half-hearted smile back. "Thanks." As she turned to leave the room, Carson watched her go, knowing full well that tonight would be the last time she'd ever feel this sense of control over her life. What she didn't know was that everything was about to change. Jasper and Heather had no idea what was coming for them. Carson's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Adela. Everything's set. He took a deep breath and glanced at the time. It was almost showtime. "Ready?" Heather asked from the doorway, her voice full of false cheer. "Always," Carson replied, his voice steady. Tonight, the game would finally end. The ballroom was a picture of elegance, with chandeliers hanging overhead and the soft hum of conversation blending with the live band playing a smooth jazz tune. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and laughter echoed from every corner. But beneath the festive atmosphere, Carson felt something far different, the calm before a storm. The anticipation of what he and Adela had set into motion gnawed at him, making it hard to fully engage with anyone around him. Heather was by his side, her black dress catching the light as she moved gracefully through the room, shaking hands, laughing, and smiling. She looked every bit the part of a successful, confident woman. Her eyes sparkled as she chatted with colleagues, her hand occasionally brushing against Carson's arm to give the illusion of unity. But Carson knew better. The distance between them felt like a chasm. He watched as her gaze frequently drifted toward Jasper, her boss. Every time she glanced at him, a secret smile would play on her lips, and Carson felt a familiar twist in his stomach. They hadn't even been subtle tonight. From across the room, Carson could see how Heather's hand lingered on Jasper's arm, how she leaned in just a little closer than was appropriate for a casual conversation. Carson stood back, observing them with a careful eye. He sipped his champagne, but the taste barely registered. He felt numb. Heather had destroyed their marriage long before this night, and yet here she was, playing the perfect wife in front of their friends and colleagues. Carson knew she thought he was oblivious to the truth, that she and Jasper had been careful enough. But tonight he had the upper hand. He saw Adela in the crowd, dressed in a simple but elegant gown. She glanced his way, their eyes meeting briefly. She gave him a small, imperceptible nod, and Carson knew that everything was ready. Tonight, it would all come crashing down. "Enjoying yourself, Carson?" Heather's voice broke his thoughts. She had appeared beside him, her face flushed from the excitement of the evening. Her eyes sparkled, but Carson could tell it wasn't because of him. "Yeah, it's been eventful," he replied, letting the double meaning hang in the air. Heather smiled, though she didn't seem to catch the weight behind his words. Just then, Jasper sauntered over, drink in hand, his cocky grin unmistakable. His arm brushed Heather's as he approached, and Carson noticed the way her posture changed, how she shifted ever so slightly toward him. "Carson, my man," Jasper greeted him with mock enthusiasm, his voice dripping with smugness. "You look like you're having a good time, right?" Carson looked at him, feeling the tightness in his chest, but keeping his expression neutral. "Sure. It's a good party," he replied simply. Jasper chuckled, taking a long swig of his drink. He was clearly enjoying himself, his arrogance unchecked. "Well, why wouldn't it be? I mean, after all, we work hard, we play hard. Right, babe?" He nudged Heather playfully, and she let out a nervous laugh, her eyes darting toward Carson, but only for a second. Carson said nothing, his grip on his glass tightening. He could feel the tension rising between them, the way the energy shifted as Jasper's words became more brazen, more cruel. Jasper thrived on this, the power he thought he had over Carson. But Carson wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of reacting. Not yet. Jasper glanced at Heather, then back at Carson. His smirk widened. "You know what's funny, Carson? Your wife here, she's got great taste. She really knows what she likes." He winked at Heather, who fidgeted with her drink, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to stop him. Carson raised an eyebrow, feigning interest. "Oh, and what's that?" His voice was calm, but inside the anticipation was building. Jasper, emboldened by the alcohol and his own ego, leaned in slightly, his voice lowering but still loud enough for the small group around them to hear. "You see, Carson, I've been doing your wife for years. And trust me, she prefers my Big Johnson to yours. Isn't that right, babe?" He turned to Heather, whose smile faltered. She giggled nervously but didn't respond. Carson stared at Jasper for a moment, letting the words hang in the air. He could feel the eyes of the people around them, some shocked, some amused, others waiting to see how he would react. But instead of anger, Carson felt a strange calm wash over him. The moment was finally here. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that took Jasper by surprise. "Is that so?" Carson said quietly, his voice smooth, almost amused. Jasper's grin wavered, confused by Carson's lack of outrage. "And you know what else?" Jasper continued, trying to regain his momentum. "Your kids? Yeah, they're mine too. You didn't even notice, did you?" The crowd around them shifted uneasily, sensing that things were taking a darker turn. Heather's face paled, her eyes wide as she stared at Carson. But Carson didn't flinch. He didn't shout. Instead, he took a step closer to Jasper, his smile never wavering. "Just like I did with your wife?" Carson said, his voice soft but sharp as a blade. Jasper blinked, his smirk faltering. Heather's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with panic. What are you talking about?" Jasper stammered, the bravado draining from his face. "Oh, we've got a surprise for you," Carson said, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. Before anyone could react, the ballroom doors swung open, and police officers marched in, their uniforms a sharp contrast to the glamour of the event. Gasps erupted from the crowd as the officers moved swiftly through the room, heading straight for Jasper and Heather. "What the hell is this?" Jasper shouted, his voice rising in panic as he backed away, his drink spilling to the floor. One of the officers stepped forward, addressing Jasper with a stern expression. "Jasper Reynolds, you are under arrest for financial fraud and embezzlement." The color drained from Jasper's face. "This is ridiculous." "You can't." The officer cut him off, his voice firm. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Heather stumbled backward, her eyes wide with terror as the realization of what was happening sank in. She turned to Carson, her voice trembling. "Carson, please." Carson met her gaze, his expression cold. "It's over, Heather." The crowd had fallen silent, all eyes on the unfolding drama. The room was no longer his playground. For Jasper and Heather, their nightmare had just begun. Heather's heart pounded as the ballroom turned into a sea of confusion. Police officers surrounded her and Jasper, their presence suffocating and surreal. The festive atmosphere of the evening had evaporated, replaced by a thick tension that choked the air. "What the hell is going on?" Heather stammered, her voice barely steady. She glanced around, desperate for some explanation, her eyes finally landing on Carson. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. He seemed too calm, too controlled, as if he had been expecting this moment. This, Heather, Carson began slowly, his voice unnervingly calm in the chaos, is what happens when you mess with the wrong people. Jasper, who had been puffed up with arrogance moments before, was now visibly deflated, his face contorted with confusion. He tried to force a smirk, his bravado faltering. This is some kind of joke, right? You can't be serious. He turned to the police officers, raising his hands as if to dismiss them. You don't know who you're dealing with. One of the officers stepped forward, unamused by Jasper's attempt at charm. Mr. Reynolds, you're under arrest for multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Jasper's face twisted in disbelief. Fraud? Embezzlement? What the hell are you talking about? Before he could protest further, another voice cut through the thick tension. It was Adela, Jasper's wife, who had moved to the front of the crowd, her face calm, but her eyes burning with intensity. It's not a joke, Jasper. We've been planning this for months. She looked at Heather, then back at Jasper, her voice laced with contempt. While you were sleeping with his wife, we were busy making sure all your dirty secrets finally came to light. Jasper's head snapped towards Adela, his confusion turning into outright panic. What? Adela, what are you talking about? This is crazy. Heather, feeling the ground slipping away beneath her, muttered, exposed. Her voice was soft, almost childlike, as if she still hadn't fully grasped the gravity of the situation. Her eyes were wide, filling with tears as she looked at Carson, silently begging for an explanation that might save her. Carson nodded, his eyes cold and distant. Yeah, exposed. All the financial records, the shell companies, the fraudulent deals you helped cover up. Adela and I uncovered it all. Heather's breath hitched. Carson, I didn't know. She looked frantically at Jasper, whose face had turned pale. You didn't tell me about any of this. Jasper's expression had shifted from confusion to pure terror. He was no longer the confident, smug boss who had openly mocked Carson earlier. Now, he was a man facing the collapse of everything he had built. He turned toward Heather, his voice rising in desperation. I didn't tell you because I didn't think it would come to this. How the hell did this happen? But Heather wasn't listening. Her legs buckled, and she sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know, she repeated, her voice cracking with fear. I thought it was just us. I didn't know about any of this, I swear. Jasper didn't respond. He was too busy grappling with the sudden realization that his world was falling apart. His eyes darted around the room, looking for a way out, but the walls seemed to be closing in on him. The officers moved swiftly. Jasper tried to pull away as they grabbed his arms to cuff him, but his struggles were weak. You can't do this, he shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. I'll have your jobs for this. You don't know who I am. The officer reading his rights remained stone-faced. You're entitled to a lawyer, Mr. Reynolds. Anything further you want to say can be said in court. Adela, watching her husband get restrained, took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge of finality in it. I hope all the lies were worth it, Jasper. The affairs, the deceit, the money. Was it all worth destroying everything? Jasper, for the first time in the evening, had no answer. He was being led away, his hands cuffed behind his back, looking smaller and more defeated with every step. His face was pale, his once arrogant smirk completely erased. Heather's sobs grew louder as she watched the man she had thrown everything away for being dragged out of the ballroom like a criminal. She turned desperately to Carson, her tear-streaked face pleading. Carson, please. I didn't know about the money. I didn't know about any of this. I was stupid. I made a mistake, but I love you. Please, don't let them take me too. We can fix this. We can fix us, right? Carson looked down at her, his face betraying no emotion. He had waited for this moment, imagined it over and over in his mind. He had thought that when it came, he might feel triumphant, but instead, he felt nothing. The person kneeling before him was not the woman he had married, not the woman he had once loved. That person had disappeared long ago. There's nothing left to fix, Heather, Carson said quietly, but with a finality that made Heather's sobbing halt for a moment. You destroyed everything. You made your choices. Heather reached for his hand, but he stepped back, avoiding her touch. Please, Carson, I'll do anything. I'll leave him. I'll leave everything behind. We can start over. Carson cut her off, his voice firmer now. Start over? Heather, it's over. You slept with him. You lied. For years, you betrayed me. And now you want to act like none of that happened? No. You made your bed, and now you're going to lie in it. Heather's face crumpled as the weight of Carson's words sank in. She had known, deep down, that this day might come, but she had never truly believed it. She had always thought she could find a way to salvage what she had broken. But now, staring up at Carson's cold, distant expression, she realized that there was no coming back from this. The officers approached her, ready to escort her out. Heather didn't resist. She had no fight left in her. She stood shakily, her body trembling with sobs as she was led out of the ballroom, just like Jasper. As the doors closed behind them, the room was left in stunned silence. The partygoers, who had witnessed the entire scene unfold, were frozen in place, unsure of how to react. Carson turned away from the spectacle, feeling a strange sense of closure. He glanced at Adela, who stood quietly near the back of the room, her face a mixture of relief and sorrow. She met his gaze, and for a brief moment, they shared a silent understanding. They had both lost something, but they had also regained something else, freedom. Without another word, Carson turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving behind the wreckage of a life that no longer belonged to him. The months that followed the unraveling at the company party were filled with chaos and legal drama. The headlines were dominated by Jasper's arrest for financial fraud, his once mighty empire now reduced to rubble. The lavish parties, the high society connections, the wealth, all of it evaporated in the blink of an eye. Every detail of his corrupt dealings came to light, and he quickly became a pariah in both the business world and his personal life. Jasper's trial was swift. The evidence Carson and Adela had gathered, meticulously documented and irrefutable, left no room for him to maneuver. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and with it his life of privilege and power came crashing down. Watching the verdict from the gallery, Carson felt no joy, only a strange sense of finality. Meanwhile, Heather's world imploded. She was left with nothing. The glamorous life she had built alongside Jasper, fueled by their affair, crumbled alongside his fraudulent empire. The home she had once flaunted, the luxury she had indulged in, all disappeared. She was forced to move into a small, run-down apartment, far from the life she had grown accustomed to. But it wasn't just the material losses that haunted her. Heather's social circle, once filled with friends who had admired her for her success and status, now shunned her. They whispered behind her back, their smiles turning into cold stares and pitying glances. She was no longer the confident, beautiful woman who could walk into any room and command attention. Instead, she was the woman who had ruined her marriage, destroyed her family, and lost everything in the process. Amidst the wreckage of her life, Heather turned to the one person she thought she could rely on, Carson. She sent him countless messages, voicemails filled with apologies, begging him to meet her, to talk, to reconsider. She stood outside his new home on more than one occasion, crying, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Every plea was filled with the same refrain, I'm sorry. Please, Carson, I made a mistake. We can fix this. But Carson had moved on. One afternoon, as Carson sat at his kitchen table sipping coffee, his phone buzzed again. Heather's name appeared on the screen. He stared at it for a moment before letting it go to voicemail, just as he had done dozens of times before. He didn't need to hear her apologies anymore. The betrayal had severed whatever bond had once tied them together. Later that day, Carson listened to one of the recent messages, his finger hovering over the delete button. Heather's voice was raw, broken. Carson, I don't know what to do. I've lost everything. I made a mistake. I know that now. Please just give me one more chance. I still love you. He paused for a moment, feeling a flicker of something deep inside, pity maybe, but it wasn't enough. He deleted the message without responding. Heather's desperation intensified in the following weeks. She showed up at Carson's workplace, her eyes hollow and desperate. Carson, please, just 5 minutes. Let me explain. I wasn't thinking clearly, Carson stopped her with a quiet, firm voice. There's nothing left to say, Heather. You made your choices. Heather's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. But we were good together, Carson. We had kids, a life. Carson's expression remained calm, though his voice carried the weight of all that had been lost. That life is over. You destroyed it. As Heather collapsed into sobs, Carson turned away, walking back into the building without another word. The door closed behind him, shutting out the last remnants of a past he no longer wanted to be part of. While Heather spiraled, Carson and Adela's bond grew deeper. What had begun as a shared mission for revenge had slowly evolved into something else, something real. They understood each other in a way that no one else could. They had both been betrayed. Both had suffered the same emotional wounds, and through that pain, they had found solace in each other's company. It started with long conversations over coffee, where they shared stories of their past, their regrets, and their hopes for the future. Adela had been through the same hurt as Carson, and together, they healed. The comfort they found in each other's presence was undeniable, and over time, the lines blurred. Friendship turned into something more, something neither of them had been expecting but welcomed nonetheless. One evening, as they sat on Carson's porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Adela broke the silence. You know, she said, her voice soft, I never thought I'd be here. After everything with Jasper, I didn't think I'd ever trust someone again. Carson glanced at her, taking in the way the fading sunlight highlighted her face. I didn't either, he admitted. But here we are. She smiled, a small but genuine smile, one that Carson had come to love. Here we are. Their relationship blossomed naturally after that. It wasn't rushed or forced. It grew steadily, like something that had always been meant to happen. They began to talk about the future, about what they wanted, not just from each other, but from life. And before long, Carson realized he had fallen in love with Adela, not because of their shared pain, but because of who she was. One summer evening, in a quiet, intimate ceremony, Carson and Adela were married. It was nothing like the lavish wedding Carson had once had with Heather. This was simple, with just a handful of close friends and family. It wasn't about the spectacle. It was about them. It was about the life they had built together, a life founded on trust and understanding. As they exchanged vows, Carson felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, peace. Meanwhile, Heather's life continued its downward spiral. She was left to pick up the pieces alone, haunted by the choices she had made. Her attempts to reconcile with Carson eventually faded, as she came to realize that he was never coming back. The love she had taken for granted was gone forever, replaced by the cold, hard truth of her mistakes. Carson never looked back. He and Adela built a life filled with laughter, joy, and the kind of love that had been missing for so long. Their home was warm, filled with the comfort of knowing they had survived the worst and come out stronger on the other side. Heather, on the other hand, spent her days in the shadows of her old life, a constant reminder of what she had thrown away. Her relationship with Jasper had ended in ruins, and her own family had disowned her after the public disgrace. The woman who had once had everything was left with nothing but her regrets. Carson had moved on, and for the first time in years, he was truly happy. The years had been kind to Carson and Adela, their lives flourishing in ways they could never have imagined during the storm of betrayal and heartache. Now, they stood on the balcony of their new home, a beautiful house nestled on a quiet hill overlooking a sprawling valley. The golden rays of the setting sun bathed the landscape in a serene glow, the colors of twilight dancing across the horizon. Carson wrapped his arm around Adela's waist as they watched the sun sink lower, the sky a cascade of pinks and oranges. There was a tranquility in the air, one they had both longed for, but hadn't been sure they would ever find again. Yet here they were, years removed from the chaos of their past, standing together in the warmth of a peaceful evening. Carson took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze brush against his skin. I never thought I could feel this at peace, he said quietly, his voice filled with the weight of everything they had endured. Adela, leaning against him, smiled and rested her head on his shoulder. "We earned this," she replied, her voice equally soft but certain. After everything, it hadn't been easy for either of them. The scars left by their former spouses had been deep, and there were times when the road ahead had seemed uncertain. But through it all, Carson and Adela had stuck together, weathering the highs and lows of rebuilding their lives. Now, those dark days felt like distant memories, mere shadows of a past that no longer held power over them. "I sometimes think about how different things could have been," Carson said after a moment, his eyes still on the horizon. He wasn't talking about regret. He had none, but about how surreal their journey had been. Adela nodded, understanding. "Me too. It's strange, isn't it? How something so painful can lead to something so perfect." Carson chuckled softly. "Yeah, I think we were both too stubborn to let the past win." Adela pulled back slightly to look up at him, her expression thoughtful. "Stubborn? Maybe. Or maybe we just knew deep down that there was something better waiting for us." He met her gaze, and for a moment, they just stood there, the silence between them comfortable and filled with the unspoken bond they shared. Their love wasn't built on the grand gestures of romance, but on the quiet, steady companionship that had grown between them over time. Carson remembered the rage, the hurt, and the humiliation he had felt when he first learned of Heather's betrayal. It had consumed him, driven him toward revenge. But now, looking at Adela, he realized that what they had now wasn't just the product of vengeance. It was the result of choosing to move forward together. The satisfaction of seeing Jasper and Heather's downfall had been sweet, but this, what he and Adela had, was sweeter. Revenge was sweet, Carson mused, his lips curling into a small, satisfied smile. He remembered the day everything had come crashing down for Heather and Jasper. The power he had felt when their smug smiles faded, when their carefully crafted lies unraveled before their eyes. It had been a moment of triumph. But Adela, ever the more insightful one, smiled gently and said, "But love is sweeter." Carson's smile softened. She was right, as always. Revenge had been fleeting, a momentary victory, but what they had built together was lasting. The real reward had been finding each other in the aftermath of all the pain. Behind them, the house was filled with reminders of their new life. Pictures of their travels adorned the walls, weekends spent hiking in the mountains, trips to the beach, quiet evenings in quaint towns. It wasn't a life of grandeur or extravagance, but one of simplicity, happiness, and genuine contentment. Every photo was a testament to the life they had created, not in spite of their pasts, but because of them. Carson turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of one of the framed pictures through the glass door behind them. It was from their wedding day, a small ceremony held in the backyard of their old home. There had been no lavish reception, no grand guest list, just a handful of friends and family who had supported them through everything. It was the day that had solidified their bond, not just as survivors of betrayal, but as partners in a new chapter of life. The sound of laughter echoed from inside the house, breaking Carson's reverie. Their children, Adela's son from her marriage to Jasper, and Carson's two kids, were playing a board game in the living room, their voices mingling in playful competition. Carson smiled, grateful for how seamlessly their families had blended together. "They've gotten so close," Adela remarked, following his gaze inside. "I was worried at first, but look at them." "Yeah," Carson agreed, his heart swelling with pride. "They've come a long way, just like us." There had been moments early on when blending their families had seemed like another daunting challenge. But the kids had adjusted better than either of them could have hoped. Carson's children had once been the painful reminder of Heather's betrayal, especially after Jasper's cruel taunts at the party. But over time, the anger had faded, and he had come to realize that they were his greatest joy, his real legacy. As for Adela's son, he had found in Carson the father figure Jasper had never been, and their relationship had grown into something strong and meaningful. Carson turned back to Adela, pulling her closer. "You know," he said, his voice low, "there was a time when I didn't think I'd ever be happy again. I thought what Heather did, what Jasper did, would break me." Adela looked up at him, her eyes filled with warmth. "And now, I'm standing here with you, and I know that everything we went through was worth it." He paused, his voice softening. I love you, Adela. She smiled, her eyes misting slightly as she whispered back, I love you too, Carson. They stood there in silence, watching as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the valley in a deep blue hue. In that moment, the ghosts of their pasts, the betrayal, the lies, faded into insignificance. Jasper and Heather were nothing more than distant memories now, reduced to footnotes in their story. Their lives, once so intertwined with Carson and Adela's, had been relegated to the background, broken and disgraced, while Carson and Adela flourished. The once toxic presence of their former spouses had no place in the peaceful world they had built. Heather and Jasper lived in obscurity now, struggling to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, while Carson and Adela had moved on to something far greater than revenge could ever provide. As the stars began to appear in the sky, Carson kissed the top of Adela's head and said quietly, We've come a long way. Adela nodded, resting her head against his chest. We have. And the best part? The rest of our lives are just beginning. Together, they watched the world go on, no longer haunted by what was left behind, but looking forward to everything that was still to come.